Okay, welcome back to another lecture. This one deals with issues of the 1930s on an international level for History 173 and leading into the Second World War or World War II and discussing the U.S.'s connection to it eventually, and then leading us into our actual discussion of the Second World War and its major ramifications for 20th century U.S. history and 20th century world history. So on this slide here, we can see very clearly that this is an era of the rise of a few dictators, and the images here are of probably someone that everyone has heard of and has seen an image of growing up in Western culture in the United States or something like that, of course, and that is Adolf Hitler, who's here on the right. But the person on the left you may not be quite as familiar with, even though many of you might be, and that is the Italian leader and fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. And Mussolini and Hitler's political alliance and their movements in the 1930s and their coming into power from a fascist position, a position of far right-wing power politically, is a part of the story of the developments of the 1930s and part of the reaction after the end of World War I, the Great War, and connecting us into the eventual coming of the Second World War in 1939 and eventually the United States joining that war in 1941. So these pictures of Mussolini and Hitler, Mussolini was actually in power 10 years longer than Hitler. Hitler was in power for about 12 years. Mussolini was in power for over 20 years, but they both shared a similar sort of political ideology and political aesthetic that was around what we would call sort of modern conceptualizations of fascism, and their political leadership and their military decisions in the late 1930s into the early 1940s are going to shape both European history, United States history, of course, and world history on a larger, more macro level. All right, so let's get into just a discussion of a couple of things here real quickly on this first substantive slide. This is another picture of Hitler doing the famous, salute, sometimes referred to as the Hitler salute, but it actually, as we can see from the earlier image with Mussolini doing it, a variation on it, it's actually better qualified as the fascistic salute, and it has its connections actually back to the Roman Empire, and they were implementing all these things that had come from earlier periods of history and earlier time periods of history particularly. So that's of course Hitler there on the right in the photograph, riding in the car. Looks like he's surveying a series of troops, and one of the things that happens, of course, is that the Nazis, the German, quote, National Socialists, even though there was nothing socialist about them particularly, became these leaders of German culture and German politics through a series of developments in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And what we're going to see happening is the ways that once particularly Hitler and his associates and the Nazis took over German political life, they did a series of things which pushed back against the limitations that were placed upon them after the end of the Great War, after the end of World War I. They recreated the German Luftwaffe, which is the German Air Force, and they did a series of things that had been prohibited against them in the Treaty of Versailles, and they also began a series of political decisions and political targeting of a series of minorities within Germany, racial, cultural, and religious, all sorts of different minorities, and very serious sets of issues when they began, of course, to target German Jewish people and other ethnic minorities in Germany, such as the Roma. They claimed, of course, that the Jewish people and the Roma people, quote, gypsies, which is an incorrect term, but that's how people sometimes refer to the Roma, that they were a different race. Of course, this is not true. But they began a series of quote, racialized policies against them and began to implement them after about 1935. Took a couple of years after Hitler gains power in the spring of 1933 for them to begin implementing these programs. And of course, this is well before the genocide of the Holocaust, which takes place, of course, during World War II, and more explicitly, and from 1941 into 1943, 1944. But it sets the policy forward, sets that conceptualization forward of defining the German nation and limiting who the Nazis felt were appropriately German, and very serious sort of racialized, quote, scientific racism that the German government was utilizing under the Nazi leadership in the 1930s. So in addition to those domestic policies, which of course are part of the story leading into World War II, there also is the story of German military and political expansion. And they began to do a series of things that were prohibited, as I said, in the Treaty of Versailles, such as marching into Austria in this thing that's known as the Anschluss, right there on that third bullet point, the Anschluss, which basically unified Germany and Austria. You might remember, some of you may know, Hitler was not even technically ethnically German. He was born in Austria, and of course Austria is very much connected to German history, but it was a completely different part of the Germanic world, and so he actually was technically not even German, even though he becomes possibly the most famous and infamous of all Germans of the modern era. So this retaking of Austria by the German government, by the Nazi-led German government in March 1938, it was explicitly barred. It was not acceptable by the Treaty of Versailles. They do it anyway. And then, of course, later in 1938, they invaded this area of this new state, this new nation state that had been crafted at the Treaty of Versailles, which was the state of Czechoslovakia. Basically, what the diplomats at the Treaty of Versailles did was they created a new state on the eastern border of Germany, throwing together ethnic groups of Czechs and Slovakian peoples, the Slovaks and the Czechs, and then also several million German people who had previously been a part of the German Empire, the German state, the German Reich, before the coming of Hitler and the Third Reich, this German Empire of the 1910s and 1920s, and they put them together in this new nation state, mixing together this group of Czechs, this group of Slovaks, and this group of Germans, and they called it Czechoslovakia. And that had happened at the end of World War I. Several states have been created out of the diplomats' negotiation at the end of World War I and at the Treaty of Versailles in Paris. Czechoslovakia was one of them. Yugoslavia was another. Poland, which had been wiped off the map since the late 18th century, was brought back onto the map. So all of these political and military and diplomatic negotiations are going forward. And Hitler and the Nazis and the German military invade this section of Czechoslovakia, this western section of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. And then there's an agreement that's made at this Munich conference at the German city of Munich, the Munich Agreement in September of 1938, where Hitler publicly stated, we've made our last claim. I will make no more territorial claims in Europe. Once we got back this area where all these Germans were living, that's going to become Germany again, take it out of Czechoslovakia, but we won't do anything else after that. And of course, that was a bold-faced lie by Hitler, because of course all it took was 6 months later when he invaded all of Czechoslovakia and took it over. So Germany is re-emerging as a power. Germany is flouting the Treaty of Versailles. Germany is undergoing a transformation politically and culturally and socially because of the advent and the coming of these National Socialist policies, these Nazi policies of the German political structure under the leadership of Hitler and his associates. And that, of course, is going to have a huge impact on not only German domestic history, but European history, and then, of course, eventually U.S. history and world history outside of that as well. Okay, so let's go real quick to this next slide, and then we'll stop this first part of this lecture. So the United States was put in a pretty difficult position in the 1930s, as we know from all our earlier reading and content and issues that we've been talking about. The U.S. was having a difficult time during the 1930s itself, as were many other nation states in the world, trying to recover from the Depression, trying to deal with their own internal economic and cultural strife. And on a larger diplomatic and international level, foreign policy level, the U.S. was trying to figure out what to do, because the U.S. was now a major world power. It had come into its own after the end of the Great War. And should the question, a larger question, which is the title slide of this the title of this slide is, should the U.S. engage in these political discussions and these international relationships, or should they be isolated from them? And there was a huge section of United States, the political reality of the United States, the polity of the United States, the people of the United States who did not want the United States to get involved in world wars, did not want the U.S. to take on a worldwide role. I think it's sometimes difficult for us, having lived through the last 70 or 80 years of U.S. history where the United States is the major power or one of the major powers, to think that there actually was a time when many Americans felt that the United States should not be having a major role internationally. But that was definitely the case during the 1930s. And there was a whole group of Americans led by this very famous American, incredibly famous, a huge celebrity of American culture, Charles Lindbergh, who was the first pilot to fly solo over the Atlantic, very famous. You might know a little bit about him. But he was only one of a series of leaders, of people in the United States, including the very well-known financier and businessman turned diplomat and ambassador Joseph Kennedy, who was the father of all the Kennedy children, who became very famous, of course, including one becoming a president, a couple of them becoming senators. Of course, John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Ted Kennedy and many of their siblings and sisters who were also famous in their own right. And Joseph Kennedy and Charles Lindbergh were just two separate leaders in this movement of isolationists who did not want the United States to get in any other European war, did not want the United States to get involved in any way. And there actually were a series of groups that were founded, the most famous of which you can see here is this America First Committee, which more recently, that discourse of putting America first, or using America, placing America first, is a political discourse that has been utilized by more recent politicians to sort of echo back to this earlier movement in the 1930s, which was in a different context, but had sort of the same idea that we don't want to be concerned with other parts of the world. We have to be concerned with what's going on in the United States. And in the 1930s, this isolationist group of leaders were a part of that movement. And this is one of the reasons why, quite often students and other people will say, why didn't the United States do more? Why didn't the Western powers do something else to stop what was happening in Germany? And part of it was because there was a very significant part of the American public who did not want the United States to get involved. Of course, many of them could never have foreseen what was coming. But that's part of the reason why the United States was dealing with its own issues, and there was a significant push to sort of eliminate the United States from having any sort of major international role during this period of time. So that's the background there. These sets of issues are happening in Germany. The persecution of German Jews is continuing. This famous night in November of 1938, this Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass, where Jewish businesses and homes were targeted throughout all of Germany. It became very clear by the end of the 1930s that Germany was openly discriminating against Jewish people and other minorities as well. And then there was a series of immigration policies that were pushed forward. We didn't have a chance to talk about it earlier, but there was a series of really strict immigration laws that were created in the 1920s. This is the period of time when the United States sort of turned its back on its relatively open immigration policy from about 1870, 1880 to 1920. And there was a serious clamping down on the amount of people who could legally immigrate to the United States. And there was a quota system that was created, this quota of how many people could come from each part of the world per year. And there were limits on that. And one of the major limits that were put on were how many Jewish people could immigrate to the United States. Very, very seriously discriminatory policy, particularly in the 1920s, and that is carrying on to the 1930s. And so when many Jewish people attempted to immigrate to the United States to flee what was happening in Nazi Germany, the United States government actually turned away a series of ships in these very famous moments, saying, we're sorry, but the quota of Jewish people who are allowed, and it's interesting because, of course, this is before the creation of the nation-state of Israel, so there was a specific category for Jewish people, which did not exist in other ways for other religious groups or other cultural groups, and so very serious sets of sort of racialized anti-Semitism that were going on here, even by the United States' government, when they did not want to allow some of these refugees to come into. Some refugees did make it in, of course, but there was a limiting of Jewish immigration in the late 1930s, which is a part of the story of the difficulty that some of these Western nations had in dealing with these complex issues at the time, and did not allow in open immigration for people who were fleeing this very serious political crisis in their own nation states, particularly in Germany and other parts of Central and Western Europe. Okay, so all that's going on, larger developments, the war is coming pretty quickly. There's all sorts of things that are going to pull out of that. So we'll talk briefly in the next section about the beginnings of the war in Europe, and then how the United States factors into that, and then the eventual coming of the United States into the war at the end of 1941. All right, that's all for now.